The battle in the void. The darkness of space was alive with fire and destruction. Laser beams cut through the void, ships exploded into burning wreckage, and alarms blared across the battlefield. Captain Zara Vulcan stood on the command deck of her warship, the Iron Fang, her golden eyes scanning the chaos. She was a warrior, a leader of the feared Silari fleet. Her people believed in strength, discipline, and honor. Today, they fought against the ruthless Skarn Empire, a race of conquerors who left only death in their path. Captain, enemy warships closing in from the left flank. Her second-in-command, Commander Vecker, shouted. Zara tightened her grip on the control panel. Raise shields. Return fire. Do not let them break our formation. The ship shook violently as enemy missiles struck. Zara remained steady, her mind focused. The Exilari were outnumbered, but they would fight to the last breath. Then something unusual appeared on her screen, a distress signal. Commander, there's an escape pod floating near the wreckage, Zara said. Scan it. Vecker frowned. It's human. A murmur passed through the crew. Humans were weak, fragile creatures. They had no place in the wars of the galaxy. Leave it, Vecker said coldly. It's not our concern. Zara hesitated. A human. Out here. Alone. It made no sense. Something about it felt wrong. Bring it aboard, she ordered. Vecker's expression hardened. Captain, that is a mistake. Humans. That was not a request, Zara said sharply. Vecker clenched his jaw but obeyed. Within moments, the escape pod was pulled into the ship's hangar. Zara turned to her crew. Hold the battle line. I'll deal with this myself. She marched through the warship, her boots echoing against the metal floor. When she reached the hangar, the escape pod was already being scanned. The outer shell was burned, the structure barely holding together. The doors hissed open. Inside, a single man lay unconscious, covered in blood and dirt. His body was lean, his clothes torn, but there was something in his posture, even unconscious, that spoke of resilience. Zara stepped forward, her sharp gaze analyzing him. How had he survived? Strange, one of the medics muttered. He has injuries, but these are old wounds. This man has been fighting for a long time. Zara knelt beside him. The moment her fingers brushed his wrist, his eyes snapped open. They were blue, deep and piercing, filled with exhaustion but also defiance. The human grabbed her wrist. Zara reacted instantly, gripping his throat and pinning him back down. The human didn't struggle. He just stared at her, unafraid. A warrior's stare. Zara slowly released him, standing up. You are aboard my ship. Who are you? The human coughed, his voice rough. Names, Jackson. Jackson Cade. A human name. Short. Simple. What were you doing in that escape pod? Zara demanded. Jackson exhaled, his body weak. Surviving. Vecker stepped forward, glaring at Jackson. He could be a spy. We should throw him out the airlock. Jackson let out a dry chuckle. You saved me just to kill me. Zara watched him carefully. Something about him intrigued her. Most humans she had encountered were either weak or terrified in the face of war. This one was different. He had the eyes of a soldier. We're in the middle of a battle, and you bring a human aboard. Vecker snapped. Zara ignored him. She looked at Jackson. You should be dead. Jackson smirked slightly. People keep telling me that. Zara narrowed her eyes. This human had secrets. She could sense it. But before she could ask more, A.L.A.R.A.M. blaring. Captain, a voice crackled through the comms. The Skarn are pushing forward. We need you back on the bridge. Zara turned sharply. Lock the human in the medical bay. We will deal with him later. Vecker hesitated. Captain, that is an order. Vecker clenched his fists but obeyed. Two guards pulled Jackson to his feet. He was too weak to fight back, but he walked, not dragged. Even injured, he moved with purpose. Zira watched him go, her mind racing. A human, drifting in the middle of a battlefield. A survivor, not a soldier. A mystery, not a threat. But Zira had a feeling. This human would change everything. A human among warriors. Darkness. Pain. The taste of metal in his mouth. Jackson Cade woke to the distant hum of a spaceship, the air thick with the scent of burnt plasma and sterilized steel. His body ached, his ribs protested with every breath. But he forced his eyes open. He was alive. For the first time in days, he wasn't drifting alone in the cold void. He wasn't gasping for air, clawing at the walls of his ruined escape pod. But survival came at a price. The moment his vision cleared, he saw them. A pair of alien guards stood over him, their sharp, feline-like faces twisted in disgust. Their armor gleamed under the medical bay's stereo lights, weapons strapped to their sides. They weren't here to help. Jackson shifted slightly, testing his limbs. His left arm was bandaged. His ribs were taped. Someone had patched him up, but not out of kindness. He was still a prisoner. Human, one of the guards spat, his voice dripping with contempt. You are in Captain Vulcan's ship. Speak carefully if you wish to leave it alive. Jackson smirked weakly. Wouldn't dream of upsetting my hosts. The guard growled but said nothing. Jackson's gaze flickered around the room. Medical bay. Dim lighting. Locked doors. A warship's medical bay, to be exact. Everything was metallic, sharp-edged practical. No warmth. No softness. Just like their captain. Zira Vulcan. The memory hit him fast. A flash of golden eyes, a strong grip, a warrior's stance. She had pinned him down like he was prey. But there was no fear in her, just calculated control. She had saved him. But why? Before he could ask, the doors slid open with a hiss. And there she was. Zira Vulcan entered the room like she owned it. Her dark armor clung to her tall, powerful frame, her shoulder-length hair braided tightly. The air around her shifted, as if the room itself recognized her authority. Jackson forced himself to sit up. Ah, the woman of the hour. Zira's expression didn't change. She strode forward and stopped at the foot of his medical bed, arms crossed. You are not dead, she said simply. Jackson raised an eyebrow. Disappointed. A flicker of amusement crossed her sharp features, gone in an instant. Your presence on my ship is a problem, she continued. A human among Silari warriors, it will not be easy for you. Jackson shrugged. I've done worse. The two guards flanking the room shifted uncomfortably, as if his confidence bothered them. Humans weren't supposed to act this way. Zira studied him for a moment, then tilted her head. You are different from the others I have encountered. Jackson smirked. You don't meet many charming humans, I take it. You joke. Her tone was flat, but there was curiosity behind her eyes. Yet I sense no fear in you. Jackson's smirk faded slightly. Fear never kept me alive. Zira held his gaze. For the first time since stepping onto her ship, Jackson felt seen. Not as a weak human, not as a problem to be discarded, but as something else. The moment was short-lived. A sharp voice interrupted. This is a mistake. Jackson turned his head as another auxiliary stepped into the room. Commander Vekar. Tall, lean, and radiating hostility, Vekar's yellow eyes were filled with open hatred. His clawed hands rested on the hilt of his blade, his posture stiff with disapproval. You should not have saved him, Captain, Vekar said, stepping closer. This human is a liability. We are at war. We do not have time for charity. Jackson sighed. You guys really have a warm welcome policy, huh? Vekar ignored him, eyes locked on Zira. He could be a spy. He could be dangerous. Zira did not flinch, and yet you fear him. Vekar stiffened. Jackson grinned. Oh, he liked her. Zira turned back to him. I did not save you out of kindness. I saved you because I want answers. Jackson's grin faded. Here it was. The real reason he was still breathing. Zira leaned in slightly, her voice lowering just enough to make the air feel heavier. "Who are you running from, human?" Jackson exhaled slowly. He could lie. He could pretend he was just another lost survivor, a victim of war. But one look at her, and he knew she would see through it. So, he did something he rarely did. He told the truth. "I wasn't running from someone," he said quietly. "I was running from something." Zira's expression darkened. The room felt colder. "What?" she demanded. Jackson's hands curled into fists. Something worse than this war. A silence fell between them. A silence that felt like the calm before a storm. Then, a sharp beep cut through the tension. Zira touched her wrist communicator. "Captain." A voice crackled through the speakers, urgency laced in every word. "We have a problem. The Skarn. They found us." Jackson's jaw tightened. They were here, and he had nowhere left to run. The unbreakable bond. The ship trembled. Not from weapons fire, not from an external force. From fear. Jackson could feel it. The subtle change in the air, the hushed voices, the way the auxiliary warriors exchanged uncertain glances. The mighty warship Iron Fang, feared across the galaxy, had just received a death sentence, because the Skarn had found them. Zira Valken stood unmoving in the center of the war room, eyes locked onto the holographic battlefield projected before her. Blue lights mapped out her fleet. Red dots, too many red dots, marked the enemy. A cold realization settled in Jackson's gut. They were surrounded. "You brought them here," Commander Vekar accused, turning toward him with a sneer. Jackson barely spared him a glance. "If I could call in a fleet of warships, don't you think I'd have better accommodations than a half-broken escape pod?" Zira remained silent, her golden eyes sharp, calculating. The tension in the room thickened, waiting for her command. Then she spoke. "Prepare for battle." Her voice was calm, controlled, unshaken. Vekar blinked. "Captain, we are outnumbered. We should flee." Jackson watched as Zira slowly turned to him, her expression unreadable. Then she looked at her crew, her warriors. "We are auxiliary," she said simply. "We do not flee." The room snapped to attention. Even Vekar, despite his protests, straightened his spine. Orders flew across the bridge. Weapons primed, shields powered up, and the Iron Fang shifted into attack formation. Jackson let out a slow breath. He had seen leaders before. Commanders, soldiers, people who thought they were warriors. But Zira Valken, she was a war machine wrapped in flesh and fire, and she had just made the Skarn's worst mistake. She chose to fight. Fire and fury. The first shockwave rocked the ship, sending a tremor through the walls. Jackson caught himself on a console, his fingers gripping the edge. Outside the viewport, the battle unfolded in a silent, deadly display. The Skarn ships moved like predators in a hunt, circling the Iron Fang like wolves. They were larger, stronger, and in greater numbers. But the auxiliary were faster. Zira's orders came sharp and precise. Flank their vanguard. Target weak points. Cut through before they regroup. Her crew obeyed without hesitation. Jackson watched in awe. He had seen humans fight. Chaotic. Desperate. But this was art. Zira moved with the battle. She anticipated the Skarn's attacks before they happened, shifting strategies mid-move. Every decision was precise. Every risk calculated. For the first time since boarding this ship, Jackson felt something he hadn't in a long time. Hope. Then the boarding alarms blared. The Skarn had breached the ship. A warrior and a survivor. The first explosion ripped through the corridor ahead. Jackson moved on instinct, pressing himself against the wall as plasma bolts lit up the passage. Shadows moved in the smoke. Skarn soldiers, massive insectoid creatures with black chitin armor and glowing red eyes. They charged. Auxiliary warriors met them in combat, blades clashing, energy weapons searing through armor. It was chaos. Jackson barely had time to react when one of the Skarn lunged for him. Its jagged mandibles snapped inches from his face. He ducked, rolled, grabbed a discarded blade. Too heavy, too unfamiliar. But he didn't have a choice. The Skarn struck again. Jackson barely blocked. His arms shook under the force. He was fast, but he was human. He wouldn't last long. Then, a blur of motion, a flash of silver and gold. Zyra Vulcan arrived. Her twin blades sliced through the air, cutting through the Skarn soldier in a single fluid motion. She moved like a storm, swift, merciless. The alien barely had time to scream before it collapsed in a heap. Zyra didn't stop. She turned, parried another attacker, her movements effortless. Jackson exhaled, watching her in stunned silence. "Stay behind me," she ordered. Jackson tightened his grip on his stolen weapon. Not a chance. Zyra's eyes flickered toward him, assessing, calculating. She didn't argue. Instead, she fought beside him. Jackson wasn't a warrior. He wasn't trained in the Xelari way. But he had survived hell before, and survival was its own kind of war. He fought dirty, disarming, dodging, using the environment. Zyra fought like a predator, precise, lethal, fearless. For the first time, they moved as a unit, a warrior and a survivor. And against all odds, they won. A different kind of strength. The battle raged on outside, but inside the Iron Fang, the Skarn invaders were pushed back. Jackson leaned against the wall, catching his breath. His arms ached, his ribs burned, but he was alive. Zyra stood beside him, her blades dripping with black Skarn blood. She wasn't even winded. She looked at him, and this time, her expression was unreadable. "You fight, strangely," she observed. Jackson let out a weak chuckle. "Humans don't have your strength. We make up for it by being stubborn." Zyra studied him for a long moment. Then, to his surprise, she offered him one of her blades. A Xelari weapon. Jackson hesitated. This wasn't just a weapon. It was a symbol. "Why?" he asked cautiously. Zyra's golden eyes locked onto his. "You may not be Xelari," she said, "but you are no longer just a human." Jackson felt something stir in his chest. Something dangerous, something terrifying, something like belonging. He took the blade. And for the first time since losing everything, Jackson Cade wasn't alone. The dark past revealed. The blood on his hands wasn't his own. Jackson Cade stood in the aftermath of battle, his breath ragged, the weight of the Xelari blade heavy in his grip. Around him, the corridors of the Iron Fang were littered with Skarn bodies, their blackened exoskeletons still smoking from the heat of battle. The scent of burnt metal and death clung to the air. He had fought. He had survived. But survival had never felt this different. "You hesitated." Zyra Vulcan's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Jackson exhaled, his fingers tightening around the hilt of the weapon she had given him. "I killed them, didn't I?" The Xelari captain stepped closer, her golden eyes unreadable. "That is not what I meant." Jackson met her gaze, but he already knew what she was getting at. For a brief moment, in the heat of the fight, he had flashed back, not to this battle, but to another. One from long ago. One he had buried beneath years of running, surviving, and pretending the past was dead. It wasn't, and Zyra had seen it. Before she could press further, the warship's intercom crackled to life. "Captain, we have secured the last of the Skarn invaders. Damage to the ship is minimal, but there's something you need to see." Zyra's gaze lingered on Jackson for a second longer before she turned away. "We're on our way." Jackson exhaled and followed. The ghost from the past. The war room's lights flickered as Zyra and Jackson entered. The massive holographic table in the center displayed a frozen transmission, a Skarn message intercepted moments before the attack. A blurry figure stood at the center of the hologram. Jackson's stomach dropped. "No," he whispered. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. The image sharpened, revealing the face of a man Jackson thought was dead. Admiral Corvus Kane. The breath left his lungs. The ship, the battle, the escape pod. It all made sense now. Kane hadn't just been looking for him. Kane had sent the Skarn to kill him. Zira studied his reaction closely. You know this man. Jackson swallowed the lump in his throat. His past was catching up to him. There was no more running. He was my commanding officer, Jackson admitted, his voice quieter than before. He was also the man who betrayed my entire unit. The silence in the room turned suffocating. Zira said nothing, waiting. Jackson exhaled. He had never told this story before. He never had a reason to. But Zira Vulcan had saved his life, fought beside him, trusted him. She deserved the truth. So he told her. The fall of Outpost Vega 9. 5 years ago, I was stationed on a human outpost. Vega 9. Small colony, nothing special. But what we didn't know was that the Skarn had been watching us. They attacked without warning. We were outgunned, outnumbered. We should have had reinforcements. Kane, he promised us backup. He told us to hold the line. That help was coming. We fought for 3 days. No sleep, no food, just war. And then the transmission came. Not from command, not from Earth, from Kane himself. Jackson's fists clenched. He told us the truth. Help was never coming. We were never meant to survive. We were a distraction, a sacrifice, a way to keep the Skarn busy while he and his fleet ran. He left us to die. Jackson's voice hardened. 86 soldiers were on that outpost. I was the only one who made it out. Silence. The kind of silence that carried weight. Zira studied him, but her expression did not change. No pity, no shock, just understanding. Jackson let out a bitter chuckle. After that, I became a ghost. A loose end Kane wanted to clean up. I've been running ever since. Zira tilted her head slightly. Until now. Jackson nodded. Yeah, until now. Because now Kane knew exactly where he was, and he was coming to finish the job. The captain's decision. Zira turned to the hologram, studying Kane's image with quiet intensity. Then she looked back at Jackson. You seek revenge, she stated. Jackson exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. I don't know what I want anymore. Zira stepped closer, her presence a force of nature. Then let me tell you what I see. Jackson swallowed. I see a soldier who was abandoned, a man who has survived the impossible, a fighter who does not realize his own worth. Her eyes darkened. You call yourself a loose end. I see a weapon waiting to be sharpened. Jackson felt his heartbeat pick up. I do not waste warriors, Jackson Cade. He believed her. And for the first time in years, he stopped running. The hunt begins. Zira turned to her crew. Find him. The auxiliary officers sprang into action, tracking the origin of the transmission, pulling data, pinpointing coordinates. Vickers frowned. Captain, you would go to war over a human. Zira's golden eyes blazed. You misunderstand, Commander, she said. This is not a war for a human. This is a war for justice. She turned to Jackson. And I do not lose wars. Jackson let out a slow breath, nodding. Admiral Kane had spent years hunting him. Now, Jackson Cade was hunting him back. The enemy strikes. It wasn't fear that gripped him. It was clarity. Jackson Cade stood on the bridge of the Iron Fang, staring at the holographic map glowing in front of him. The cold blue light reflected off Zira Vulcan's sharp features as she studied the enemy fleet assembling on the outer edge of the system. He had been running from this moment for years. Not anymore. This is a trap, Vickers muttered, arms crossed. Kane is baiting us. Jackson smirked. Then he's gonna be real upset when we spring it. Zira turned to face him, unreadable as always. You wish to confront him. Jackson exhaled slowly. I have to. If I run again, I'll never stop running. Zura held his gaze for a long moment before nodding. Then we finish this. Her golden eyes flashed as she turned to her crew. Prepare for warp. We're taking the fight to them. The order sent a shockwave through the warship. Vekar tensed. Captain, this is madness. Kane commands an entire fleet. Zura's voice was calm. Too calm. And yet he fears one man enough to send that fleet after him. She glanced at Jackson. That tells me all I need to know. Vekar scoffed. He is just a human. Jackson stepped forward, rolling his shoulders. Then you better hope you never piss off a human. Zura smirked. Set the course. The Iron Fang surged forward, its engines roaring as it punched through the void. This wasn't just a battle. This was an execution. The final gambit. The Iron Fang dropped out of warp at the edge of the Crucible Nebula, a stretch of space littered with asteroid fields and the burnt wreckage of old battles. Waiting for them was Kane's fleet, a dozen warships, heavy cannons primed, shields at full power. At the center of it all sat Kane's flagship, the Dominion, a monstrous behemoth of steel and fire. Jackson exhaled sharply. He brought the whole damn army. Zura tilted her head slightly. Good. Saves us the trouble of hunting them down later. Jackson chuckled, shaking his head. You really don't do half measures, do you? Zura didn't answer. She didn't have to. The comms crackled. A voice came through. Smooth, controlled, dripping with arrogance. Jackson Cade. Jackson clenched his jaw. Kane, you should have stayed dead. Jackson stepped forward, locking eyes with the image of the man who had destroyed his life. Yeah, you should have killed me when you had the chance. Kane smiled. A predator's smile. I intend to correct that mistake. The line cut. The enemy ships moved. Battle had begun. The sky burns. Laser fire erupted across the battlefield. The Iron Fang weaved through enemy formations, outmaneuvering Kane's fleet with sheer speed. But speed wasn't enough. Jackson gritted his teeth as explosions rocked the hull. Kane's forces had numbers, firepower, and the advantage of terrain. If this turned into a battle of attrition, they were doomed. Suggestions. He called over the chaos. Zura was already 3 steps ahead. We take the Dominion. Cut off the head, the body dies. Jackson let out a breathless chuckle. You want to board that thing? Zura gave him a look. Afraid. Jackson grinned, heart pounding. Terrified. Let's go. Storming the Dominion. The Iron Fang pierced through enemy lines, its shields barely holding as it closed in on Kane's flagship. Zura led the boarding party, Jackson at her side. Blades. Guns. Fire in their blood. The docking clamps locked. The doors hissed open. And hell followed. Kane's soldiers were ready, but Zura was faster. She carved through them like a living weapon, her twin blades flashing in the dim corridor light. Jackson moved differently, human fast, dirty, unpredictable. He fired a stolen plasma rifle, took cover, disarmed, countered, survived. For the first time in years, he wasn't fighting to escape. He was fighting to end it. The final confrontation. They reached the command center. The doors slid open. And there he was, Admiral Kane, alone, waiting. Zura stepped forward, blade raised, but Jackson stopped her. This is my fight, he said quietly. Zura hesitated. Then, with a nod, she stepped aside. Jackson stepped forward. Kane smirked. You think this ends with me? Jackson didn't answer. Kane's hand moved, reaching for his weapon. Jackson was faster. One shot. Center mass. Kane staggered. Blood spread across his uniform. He looked at Jackson, something like surprise in his fading eyes. You really did survive. Jackson stepped closer. Yeah, he said. And you didn't. Kane collapsed. It was over. The weight of victory. The Iron Fang escaped the Dominion just as it exploded, taking the rest of Kane's forces with it. On the bridge, Jackson watched the wreckage burn. The weight in his chest felt different now. Lighter. Zira stood beside him. It is done. Jackson let out a breath. Yeah. She studied him. And yet, you do not look relieved. Jackson chuckled softly. Guess I don't know what to do now. Zira's golden eyes gleamed. Then stay. Jackson turned to her, surprised. Zira looked at him like she had the first day he arrived. Not as a liability, not as a weak human, but as something more. You are no longer just a survivor, Jackson Cade, she said. You are auxiliary now. A slow smile crossed his lips. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't running. The final stand. The war should have ended with Kane's death. It didn't. Jackson Cade stood on the bridge of the Iron Fang, staring at the devastation outside. The wreckage of Kane's fleet drifted in the abyss, burning in the darkness. But the victory was hollow. The real enemy had been watching. A new signal had appeared on the sensors. A ship. No, a Leviathan. Massive. Ancient. Something far worse than Kane. Zira Valken's golden eyes narrowed as she read the transmission scrolling across the screen. The crew around her murmured in unease, their warrior instincts detecting the same thing Jackson felt in his gut. Dread. Captain. Vekar's voice was tight, unreadable. We have a problem. The transmission was simple. A single message. The hunt is not over. The true master is coming. And then Jackson saw the name attached to the message. His blood ran cold. Because he knew it. The Harbinger. Something worse than Kane. The ship that appeared before them was wrong. It didn't move like other warships. It drifted, silent, as if it were breathing. Its hull was twisted black metal, pulsing with eerie red veins. It was enormous, 3 times the size of the Dominion. And yet it made no sound, no threatening gestures. It simply waited. Zira straightened her shoulders, voice calm but sharp. Hail them. A pause. Then the screen flickered. A figure appeared. Tall, cloaked in shadow. Its face hidden behind a mask of bone and metal, only its glowing eyes visible. It was not human. Not Skarn. Not Xilari. Something else. Ah, the figure said, voice smooth, cold. The survivor and the warrior, together at last. Jackson's fists clenched. Who the hell are you? The masked being tilted its head slightly. Names are for lesser beings, but you may call me Valerax. Something about that name sent a shiver down Jackson's spine. Zira remained steady. State your purpose. Valerax chuckled. I come to finish what Kane could not. Jackson felt it then. The slow, creeping realization. Kane had never been the real danger. He had been a pawn. And this was the one pulling the strings. The monster behind the curtain. You've been hunting me, Jackson said, voice dangerously calm. Valerax nodded. Of course. You are an anomaly, Jackson Cade. A loose end. And loose ends are untidy. Jackson exhaled slowly. Why? Why am I so important to you? The being's glowing eyes narrowed. Because, human, you are the last key to something much greater than you realize. The screen glitched, flashing images too fast to process. Jackson caught glimpses. A world burning, bodies floating in darkness, something vast awakening beneath a planet's surface. And then he saw himself, standing at the center of it all. His head pounded. He stumbled back, gripping the console. Zira's hand was on his shoulder instantly. Jackson. He barely heard her. What the hell was that? He hissed. Valerax smiled. A glimpse of what is coming. Then the transmission cut, and the Harbinger began to move. The last stand of the Iron Fang. Shields up. Zira barked. Weapons online. The Iron Fang barely had time to react before the Harbinger unleashed its first attack. A pulse. Not a laser, not a missile. Something deeper, darker. A wave of energy that crawled through the ship, disabling half the systems in an instant. Lights flickered. Gravity stuttered. Crew members collapsed, screaming, clutching their heads. Jackson felt it too. A pressure in his skull. A whispering voice in the back of his mind. Something telling him to surrender. He gritted his teeth, fought against it. Zira growled, forcing herself to stand. Counterattack. Now. The Iron Fang fired its entire payload. Plasma cannons, railguns, torpedoes, everything. The Harbinger didn't even flinch. The shot struck its hull and simply vanished, absorbed into the black metal like drops of water into sand. It was playing with them. And that's when Jackson knew. They couldn't win. Not like this. The last choice. The bridge was in chaos. Alarms blared. Crew shouted orders. But Jackson ignored it all. Because he finally understood. Kane wasn't the endgame, he muttered. He was just delaying me, keeping me distracted. Zira turned to him sharply. Explain. Jackson ran a hand through his hair. I don't know why, but this thing wants me. I don't know what it means by me being a key, but whatever it is, it's bad. Zira's gaze flickered to the Harbinger, then back to him, calculating, deciding. Finally, she nodded. Then we do not let it have you. Jackson frowned. That's not. But Zira had already made the call. Prepare the slipstream drive, she commanded. We're getting out of here. Vecker balked. Captain, we are retreating. Zira didn't blink. We are surviving. And we will live to burn this thing to the ground. Jackson stared at her. You're really willing to fight this thing for me? Zira stepped closer, her voice firm. I told you before, Jackson Cade. You are Xelari now. Something in Jackson's chest tightened. Family. For the first time since Vega 9, he had a family again. The escape. The Iron Fang's engines roared as it powered up the slipstream drive. The Harbinger reacted instantly. It knew what they were doing. It fired another pulse. The lights flickered. The drive stuttered. Jackson clenched his fists. Come on, come on. Zira took his hand. Not out of fear, not out of desperation, out of trust. The ship jumped, and the Harbinger disappeared into the void behind them. The war is not over. The Iron Fang re-emerged in deep space, battered, barely holding together, but alive. Jackson exhaled. Zira stood beside him, watching the stars drift by. We should have died back there, Jackson muttered. Zira smirked. Then it is a good thing we do not follow rules. Jackson chuckled, shaking his head. So, what now? Zira's golden eyes gleamed. Now, she said, we prepare for war. And for the first time, Jackson wasn't running from it. He was running toward it. The warrior and the survivor. The war should have ended. Instead, it was just beginning. Jackson Cade stood at the edge of the command deck, staring at the vast emptiness of space. The Iron Fang drifted in the shadows of a dying star, its hull scorched from their last battle. The crew worked in tense silence, repairing damage, preparing for what was coming. What was already here, because the Harbinger hadn't stopped hunting them. It had followed. It had waited. And now it was here. Zira Valken stepped beside him, her golden eyes unshaken. We cannot run forever. Jackson nodded. I know. Then we end it. He turned to her, his jaw clenched. And if we fail? Zira smirked. Then we fail fighting. The last battle begins. The warning sirens wailed. Jackson spun toward the main viewport. In the distance, the Harbinger had arrived. It emerged from the void like a nightmare, its hull shifting, pulsing with dark energy. It wasn't just a ship. It was alive. The Xelari crew stiffened, sensing the unnatural presence creeping through the air. Vecker swallowed hard. It shouldn't exist. Jackson ignored him, his mind already racing. Running wasn't an option. Hiding wasn't an option. That left only one choice. All weapons online, Zyra ordered. Target everything we have. Vecker hesitated. Captain, our weapons do nothing against it. Zyra's expression hardened. Then we aim for what it fears. Jackson frowned. And that is. She turned to him. You, the key to everything. Jackson's blood ran cold. What are you saying? Zyra's golden eyes locked onto his. It has been hunting you. It calls you the key. Then that means, in some way, you are its weakness. Jackson exhaled. That's a dangerous gamble. Zyra smirked. Those are my favorite kind. The Harbinger fired first. A pulse of energy ripped through the void, heading straight for the Iron Fang. The shields barely held as the ship rocked violently, power flickering. We won't last long, Vicard yelled. Jackson clenched his fists. Then let's stop waiting to die. He turned to Zyra. Get me aboard that thing. Vecker's eyes widened. You're insane. Zyra was already moving. Prepare the strike pod. We're breaching it. Jackson hesitated. We? Zyra met his gaze. You are not dying without me, human. Jackson's throat tightened. He didn't argue. They ran. Into the belly of the beast. The strike pod launched into the void, weaving through debris as the Harbinger's weapons tore through space. Jackson gripped the controls, heart hammering. The Harbinger was unlike any ship he had ever seen. Its surface wasn't metal. It was shifting, writhing, as if it were breathing. They slammed into its hull. The moment they breached the surface, Jackson knew this wasn't just a ship. It was a prison. For something older. Something worse. Zyra drew her blades, stepping forward. Whatever happens, we do not stop moving. Jackson exhaled. Fine by me. They entered the darkness. The truth of the Harbinger. The inside of the Harbinger was wrong. Corridors pulsed like veins. Walls twisted and shifted as if aware of their presence. The air was thick with whispers, voices that weren't their own. And then the shadows moved. Jackson barely had time to react as something lunged from the walls. A creature, humanoid but warped, its flesh stretched and torn. It wasn't just a ship. It was feeding. The Harbinger wasn't a warship. It was a vessel of something ancient, a force that consumed, a parasite. And now, it wanted him. Facing Velrax, the chamber at the heart of the Harbinger was vast, stretching beyond the limits of reality itself. Velrax was waiting. You should not have come, the creature said, its voice echoing. Now you will see the truth. Jackson tightened his grip on his stolen Silari blade. I'm tired of running from the truth. Velrax laughed. You think this is about you? It gestured, and the shadows twisted. A vision flashed before Jackson's eyes. Earth, burning. Silari worlds, falling. The stars themselves being consumed. Jackson stumbled. What the hell? Velrax's eyes glowed. You were never just a survivor, Jackson Cade. You were chosen. You are the final catalyst. Zyra lunged. Velrax caught her blade mid-strike. The creature didn't even flinch. You cannot kill what exists beyond time, it whispered. Jackson moved. He didn't know why, didn't know how, but something inside him awakened. The Silari blade in his hands glowed, pulsing in rhythm with the ship. The whispering stopped. Velrax's eyes widened. No, the creature hissed. It is too soon. Jackson didn't hesitate. He drove the blade forward. And everything shattered. The end and the beginning. Jackson woke to silence. The Harbinger was gone. Or maybe it had never been there. The Iron Fang floated in the void, Zyra standing beside him, golden eyes watching. You did it, she said simply. Jackson sat up, rubbing his head. I have no idea what I did. Zyra smirked. Neither do I. Jackson exhaled. Is it over? Zaira looked at the endless stars. For now. Jackson chuckled. That's not comforting. Zaira turned to him, expression softer than before. Then let me comfort you another way. She held out her blade. Jackson frowned. What's this? A warrior's.